Hello there, AP World History students. Today we're going to talk all about imperialism in Asia. Went basically the same way it did in Africa, but different side of the world. So here we go. Using the same tactics, especially Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands took their militaries and just dominated the majority of the continent. The French kind of took just about everything in Southeast Asia. Britain was all about India, Myanmar, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and also Malaya. The Dutch were all about those Spice Islands. That's their favorite freaking thing. Russia was all about Northern Asia. And America and Japan, they're also going to get involved a little bit as well. Let's learn about it. Okay. So, of course, the big country in Asia is China. And for almost all of human history, as you guys know, China's been a pretty important spot. It's the destination for traders. It's the richest part of the world. And for so much of human history, China was the place to be. But during the age of imperialism, that is no longer going to be the case. Britain was the one who really started to kind of tear down China's supremacy because they realized that they loved Chinese products, especially tea during this period. All the British people just loved tea, and they could only get tea in China. China, of course, loved silver, and that's how they did trade for a while. But eventually, Britain's like, you know what? I'm going to keep my silver. Silver's expensive. White people like silver too. So, hey, China, how about drugs? And drugs were, of course, very illegal in China, but British drug dealers started kind of illegally trading opium for tea and other Chinese goods. And opium started to become widespread throughout China. And opium comes from the poppy plant. Here's a picture of it right here. And the poppy plant grows real well in India, so it was kind of easy for Britain to kind of transfer their connections in India into China in order to get all these wonderful Chinese goods. The Chinese government did not like drugs being sold, so they started to crack down on these British drug dealers. They killed some of them, they jailed some of them, they destroyed a lot of their products. And so, in response, Britain was like, you know what, China, we're going to go to war with you with the purpose that we will sell you drugs after we win this war. So it's kind of the stupidest reason to go to war in a modern sense. But hey, so the British Navy sailed their gunships up and down China's rivers. They blew up China's military installations. They took over various cities. And the Chinese emperor sent his military to stop it. But his military was crushed. And his military was crushed for all the same reasons that militaries in Africa failed. It was that they didn't have these fancy new industrial inventions. And the thing is, technically there were like 4 opium wars, but they all ended the same way. It was all various European countries boggled into China, blew up a bunch of stuff with the express purpose of continuing to have this open market system with China, but especially to sell China drugs. And the Chinese emperor eventually conceded and gave Europeans the full right to sell drugs to the Chinese people. And so many Chinese people were doing drugs all the time. It's ridiculous. I'll get in on the next slide. Okay. This is drug dealing on a worldwide scale. The British started to make unbelievable amounts of money selling opium in China. And, I mean, China is such a big market. There were probably close to 1 billion people in China, even at this time. And other industrial countries were also coming in, and they were also selling drugs all around China. And I think the statistic is something like this. I have it right here. 100 million Chinese people were daily opium users. It's something like 75% of the working male population were just spending so much of their time and so much of their money just smoking opium, just turning into human slugs. And opium is the same stuff we use today in obituates and heroin. And I know even today the United States is having kind of this opioid epidemic. Well, it can be kind of related back to this time period in China, where China kind of lost its pride at being the top dog country of the world. So they were just vulnerable to drug use in the population, and it really gave China a bad rap. I mean, for the next 100 years or so, the international reputation of Chinese people is going to be that they're lazy drug abusers that just smoke opium all day. And it was a huge bad mark on China's national pride and their reputation with the rest of the world. And just to give you a perspective, with 100 million people buying opium every day, the British government was just raking in money. Okay, and I even have this on here too. It's for the first time in world history, silver started flowing out of China. Like, the British bought all the tea they could ever want, all the porcelain, all the silk, and Chinese people still wanted more drugs. So like, okay, we'll take some of that silver back. And by the time we get to the year 1950, there's almost no silver left in China. It's like, what? China was raking in silver for hundreds of years, and they blew it all on drugs. Oh, so terrible. Such a terrible part of world history. And it's the Europeans' fault. I mean, China was doing just fine, and they just pushed drugs on everybody. Okay, so here's just some more pictures of the ridiculousness of how prevalent opium was. All over the world, you could find these businesses called opium dens. They were typically run by Chinese people and typically occupied by Chinese people. But you would find these in London, San Francisco, all cities all over the world. And it was kind of like these businesses where people could just legally use opium and just kind of get high all day and lie down and turn into a human slug. And opium does a lot of really terrible things to your body, kids. I've got this little picture right here. It shows you that it like messes with your blood flow and it makes little holes in your brain. It's not good. And when so many Chinese people are doing this, it's sort of like they can't even resist the growing power of the industrialized countries taking over them. And yeah, it stereotypes Chinese people as lazy, super duper rude. Okay, moving on. Yeah, look at this British guy just shoving opium down this guy's throat. Ugh, it's ridiculous. And yeah, as you could tell, by losing all those opium wars and having all their people addicted to drugs, for the first time in world history, China was defeated by someone other than a Mongol. And what's kind of awkward is right around this period, China sort of officially finished construction of the Great Wall, thinking that, you know, their northern flank is secure, so China will be safe forever. But the real threat came from the sea. So that's just a mistake. But the Opium Wars especially showed how industrial militaries and new weapons of war just made the old ways of running militaries just worthless. Okay, and China would be bullied around by industrial powers for the next 100 years. China's just not really a player on the international stage. China calls this period the Century of Humiliation. It is absolutely the worst 100 years of China's history, and it's fairly recent history. So you could probably understand that a lot of vibes in China today are like, China's strong, China's this great superpower, and they want to reclaim their previous role they held for almost all of human history. And I think this picture is quite telling. It's, you know, the Chinese dragon is kind of like knocked out and sleepy because he's addicted to opium, while the Russian bear, the American eagle, the German eagle, the British lion, the Italian fox, they all fight over the remains of China. That's pretty sad. Oh, and the Japanese tiger. Yep, Japan's in the game too. Okay, moving on. So, not only was, well, the Opium War was probably the biggest hit that kind of knocked China down, but there's some other pretty awful things that happened in China during that first half of the Century of Humiliation. And all of these things kind of collectively together show that the Chinese government was really weak, and that they were easily exploited by industrialized powers. So some of these crises that China faced, and honestly, I should probably make like a simulation where like the students are like the Chinese government and just all these terrible things continually happen to them. But let's check it out. So these crises include Chang Sao. I've got a picture of her right here. She's in his history remembers her as Madame Chang. I probably should have written that on there instead. Madame Chang, she is the most successful pirate in human history. She commanded a fleet of 300 ships that largely operated in the South China Sea. and her incredible fleet of pirate ships not only outnumbered the entire Chinese Navy, it outclassed the entire Chinese Navy. And she'd made a lot of deals with Europeans and the Japanese when she got these brand new ships, these brand new guns. So she was able to just basically own the waters around China, and she extorted so much money from the Chinese government, it's ridiculous. Another terrible crisis that China faced was Chinese Jesus, Hong Zhuichan. Here's a picture of this guy. Hong Zhuichan was a Chinese farmer, lived about roughly the time of the U.S. Civil War. I want to say like 1860. And Hong Zhuichan, he had a belief that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ. And he got millions of Chinese people to follow him, and he staged his own civil war in China called the Taiping Rebellion, where he wanted to carve his special version of Christianity in the country of China. Well, the Chinese emperor wasn't going to have that, and also once he started talking to a bunch of Europeans, and he's like, I am the second coming of Jesus, and Europeans were like, we don't think so. The Europeans actually put him down too, and the Taiping Rebellion is one of the biggest wars in the history of the world when you just look at the number of people killed and the people involved. But ultimately, his Civil War rebellion was crushed, and it just showed you how even more weak the Chinese government was because of how long it went on. Another crisis that happened in China was the Boxer Rebellion. Here's a picture of that right here. And when you think of the Boxer Rebellion, maybe your brain is like, oh, people in like a boxing ring punching each other. Like, no, that's not the case. The Boxers were a group of Chinese terrorists who went around the country killing foreigners. Boxers was kind of this populist response to all these foreigners selling drugs and teaching Christianity that started this evil civil war and supporting the Red Flag Fleet. So these were like Chinese nationalists who wanted to claim China back as their own. Well, the international community wasn't going to have that, and they're like, sorry, we won all these opium wars, we're going to sell you drugs. And the Boxers did kill a bunch of white people around China, but then the United States, the Japanese, the Germans, the British, the French, the Italians, every single industrial country united together sent this huge army into China, and they just rampaged around China. They found all the Boxers, and they knocked them out the box. Okay, and then the Pathé Rebellion, that was this part of China that declared its independence. The Chinese government tried to bring them back, didn't really work. The Hakka Clan Wars, that was another kind of mini civil war in the bottom part of China. And then they have two wars with Japan, and both those wars end terribly for the Chinese. Well, I mean, they sort of win the second war because it was a part of World War II, but really terrible, terrible things in China occurred during World War II. So, in totality, all of these crises just show you how terrible of a humiliating century it was for China. Think about the year 2020, but drag it out over 100 years. And that's what it was like living in China during this period. Okay, and so eventually, probably about halfway through the century of humiliation, China's imperial government just collapses. People just stop listening to the emperor, they don't care anymore, and the industrialized countries just had free reign to impose their power over China. And this is kind of just a rude thing that they did in China. They actually encouraged some of those crises. I mean, they did put down the Chinese Jesus crisis, but as far as the Hakka Clan Wars and the Pathé Rebellion, they were like, oh, hey, this will fracture China. This will make China have all these different regions, and it's a lot easier to control a small area than a large area. So they wanted China to fracture, and they wanted to sort of turn China into Africa. They wanted to have this kind of Berlin Conference of China, so they could each post their own mini countries around China and kind of divide it in the same way that Africa was. So this period is known as the warlord period. It's kind of the second half of the century of humiliation, and China was basically 20 different countries with almost no national stability. Whew, man. Yeah, so overall, I hope you have in your notes, this was a bad time for China, because that's kind of the big theme here. And this is an interesting historical document. This is a picture of all the different countries that were represented when they put down the Boxer Rebellion. So you see, you've got the United States, France, Germany, and here you have Japan. Even the Japanese joined the team. Okay, and so speaking of Japan, Japan got in the imperial game as well. Okay, they saw all these Europe and the United States, they're taking over places around the world. Japan wants it too. So even though Japan was pretty freshly industrialized, we're just coming out of the Meiji period, Japan was ready for the game. So they absorbed Korea, Taiwan, and northern China. They kind of carved out their piece of China. They called it Manchukuo. And the thing is, I can probably argue that King Leopold II in Belgium were the worst imperial power. But undoubtedly, the second worst imperial power was the Empire of Japan. Japan did terrible, terrible things to Korea, China, and Taiwan. Here's just some examples. They made native languages illegal in those countries and said all those people must speak Japanese at all times. There were accounts that even if Korean people wrote the Korean language, they would get their hands cut off or just get killed. They forced all those populations to convert to Shinto Buddhism. It's this special kind of Buddhism where the Japanese emperor is a living god. And the bigger thing, too, is they enforced their own social Darwinism on other Asian ethnic groups. Social Darwinism wasn't just a concept that said white people are better than everybody else. The Japanese adapted that concept and said, you know what, the Japanese are better than white people. But then they also further dictated that the Japanese are better than all other Asians as well. And they did a lot of really salty things toward Korea, especially because I have a lot of personal experience because I lived there, and I saw a lot of Korean museums and history stuff, and Japan treated Korea just terribly. So much so, like, here, let me share some stories. Like, I remember that I took a girl on a date in Korea, and I was like, hey, you want to get sushi? And she was like, oh no, sushi's Japanese. We're not getting sushi. I was like, wow, like, still salty. Okay. And then also, like, I asked my students if they liked anime, and they're like, teacher, I would never watch anime. Anime is Japanese. And I know even like a couple years ago, Japan was having a dispute with China over ownership of some islands off the Chinese coast, and a bunch of Chinese people formed riots, and they went to like Honda dealerships and blew up a bunch of Japanese-made cars. So, wow. Very, very much still angry against Japan for some of these racist things they did during the imperialism period. Okay, moving on. So let's talk about some failed resistance during the time of imperialism. This is a very interesting historical event that I believe you kids can kind of learn a life lesson from. And this lesson sort of relates to, you really should understand other people's cultures before you require them to do something they might not want to do. And so this event is known as the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion in India. First of all, what are sepoys? Sepoys are Indian men who serve in the British Army. And at this time, there are over 100,000 of these sepoys. And, they're just Indian dudes who have white officers. And the sepoys, they were sent all over the British Empire. And they just, followed orders, did the work. And the kind of real sad thing is a lot of these sepoys were employed to secure India and to force the Indian people to pay taxes to the British Empire. So this is sort of, they were the tools of the British Raj, so to say. And the thing that sparked off this rebellion was Britain ordered these sepoy soldiers to use a new kind of rifle cartridge that had their bullets inside of them. So, if you wanted to load up one of these old-timey rifles, you had to bite off the casing around a bullet, you put the bullet into the gun, and then you could shoot the gun. Well, those bullet casings were encased in grease containing cow and pig fat. And as soon as the sepoys figured it out, they're like, wait, what? I've been biting into cow fat, pig fat. Like this, the Hindus were really pissed off because it was cow fat. The Muslims were really pissed off because it was pig fat. I probably should have wrote pig fat on here as well. And it pissed off the sepoys so much that it was the spark they needed to say, you know what, we don't want these British here at all. They don't understand our culture. They don't vibe with us. We're going to fight back. And so it was a real serious rebellion. It was the closest India came to being independent before 1947. And so they killed a whole bunch of British people, went all over the country, tried to create independence. But Britain wasn't going to lose their favorite colony, so they sent in all the soldiers they had in their whole empire, and they did put down this rebellion. And afterwards, they were like, wait, you guys did this because of new bullets we asked you to use? And they're like, well, that was kind of the main reason, yeah. And so Britain changed that after the fact. But it shows you, like, you got to understand what other cultures are about. That's the lesson there. Okay, moving on. So, yes, this is, of course, still, even despite the Sepoy Rebellion, the British Empire's golden age. During the late 1800s, Britain was the undisputed superpower of the world. They had the most land, they had the most wealth, they had just connections everywhere. And if you kids are trying to keep track of, like, you know, what country's sort of the winner of global domination in world history, I'd probably have to say it's the British Empire. They did have more land than the Mongols, just barely. Some people will argue that, well, the Mongols had a contiguous empire. It's like, but the British were just all over the frickin' world. And also during this period, Britain got their navy to top-tier shape, and no other country in the world could challenge the British Navy. And that's why there's that patriotic song, Britannia Ruled the Waves, and you're all going to listen to it in this class. All right, top-tier British Empire. Okay, so something else you got to know is Spain and Portugal, honestly Spain even more so than Portugal, they didn't have the industrialized economies that the rest of the world did, because you got to have an industrialized economy if you want to play this game now. And why did Spain fail so bad? Well, Spain had 3 major civil wars in the 1800s, and those civil wars distracted Spain so much they could never build up their factories. People around the world noticed how weak Spain was, especially the United States. So the United States declared war on Spain in the Spanish-American War, and our Navy at that time was these brand new ironclad warships with all the new pieces of industry involved in them, while the Spanish ships were still made out of wood. Okay, the Spanish ships never really had any upgrades since the Manila Galleon period. So, and a great example of just how unstoppable these industrialized weapons of war are is the Battle of Manila Bay. During the Spanish-American War, we invaded the Philippines. It was occupied by Spain at the time. And the Spanish fleet was anchored in Manila Bay. 1 U.S. warship went in there, and we blew up every single ship in their entire fleet. The Spanish ships were just unloading everything they could at our ship, but our ship was covered in iron. Cannonballs don't work anymore, bro. So the USA lost 0 men. Spain lost their entire fleet and 300 men. So it's just like, boom, dominated. But yes, it's an excellent example of how industrialized militaries are just God mode versus pre-industrial militaries. It's not even a fair fight at all. Portugal, they also lost a lot of their empire for similar reasons. They also had some civil wars. They had a lack of industry. Portugal is going to be kind of a player in Africa, even until like the 1960s. But Spain basically loses everything it had to the United States. So, sorry, Spain. Okay, let's talk briefly about Native Americans. So, the United States, in our course of imperialism, we sort of imperialized the native peoples of the United States. And a lot of them were not happy with us, surprisingly not. Well, there you go. And so the native peoples, they fought many wars against us. They had some successes, for example, at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But ultimately, native people realized how hopeless their situation was to resist militarily. Largely because these new weapons are just dominating the landscape even more. So Native Americans decided to do a kind of a religious cultural experience called the Ghost Dance. And it claimed that if Native Americans performed this special kind of dance, then the dead would come back to life and white men would vanish from their lands. And I don't think there was anything inherently violent about the ghost dance. But the U.S. government heard about this, and they sort of saw it as a threat. They said, like, oh, well, their intention is to ultimately get rid of all the white men in the land. So the U.S. increased their military patrols near where natives lived, and one of these patrols had a really negative encounter with some of the Lakota Sioux at a place called Wounded Knee. And the historical account is still a little sketchy of exactly what happened, exactly who started it. But at Wounded Knee, these U.S. soldiers ride up to this Indian settlement, and while they're there, someone fires a gun. And like back then, guns were kind of faulty. Sometimes they just kind of shot on their own, probably shot it in the air. But as soon as the U.S. soldiers, they were kind of spooked. They heard a gunshot, so they just started unloading bullets into this crowd of Indian civilians, and they killed hundreds of people. So it's a really terrible thing that happened against the Native American community. And after that, they stopped doing the ghost dance, and Native Americans have never really had another organized resistance against the United States ever since. So that's real sad. Okay, moving on. And this is economic imperialism. I'll talk about this next time. All right, peace out.